Well, thank you. I think maybe I'll have my next project now on Trump and this tortoise reserve in Florida. You know, when Christoph asked me to do this a week ago, since I've never been here, he suggested that I could watch some of the previous talks online and see what was expected of me. And I did that, and they all started off with the speaker standing up here, kind of in awe of the introduction. But the introduction's never filmed. I wish that it were, but now I understand why. So thank you. That was a very kind introduction, perhaps a bit exaggerated at points, but I appreciate that. It's so wonderful to be here at the Carson Center. I have been looking forward to this very much, and I'm very much looking forward to getting to know many of you who I haven't met yet since I've just been here a week. Today I'm going to talk about this book project that I will be working on while I'm here for the next 6 months. It's titled On the Backs of Tortoises, and it's about the Galapagos, of course, where I've had the privilege of working for the last 10 years. I imagine the Galapagos are a place that a lot of you know something about. Some of you probably have even been to Galapagos. It's a place that nature documentaries and tourism advertising often present as one of the last footholds of pristine nature. The archipelago is 1,000 kilometers, about 600 miles, off the coast of South America and the Pacific Ocean. And it's a place where both scientists and tourists go today, where they can get away from the hustle of urban life, when they can see nature that's supposedly untouched by human hands, and it's somehow out of reach of these environmental crises that seem to plague much of the world today. Going to the Galapagos is supposed to be like stepping back into a land before time, where these austere volcanoes, rugged lava shores, and these strange reptilian inhabitants seem to speak to the very origins of life. Indeed, after Darwin visited as a young man in 1835, he wrote the islands were provided a window onto the first appearance of new beings on this earth. Today, of course, the Galapagos are famous as one of the places that inspired Darwin's theory of evolution. His work sparked a movement to conserve the islands as a natural laboratory of evolution, where endemic species like the giant tortoises evolved in seclusion from the rest of the world. For 50 years now, naturalists have worked to maintain the island's isolation, even trying to return them to a supposedly pre-human condition, as they supposedly were when Darwin saw them. Now, this connection between Darwin and conservation I find fascinating, because when conservationists in the Galapagos talk about their work, it isn't only about restoring pristine nature, as it is in many national parks around the world, but it's about conserving evolution itself. And this I find to be a perplexing and paradoxical idea, because conservation, as it's been practiced in the islands, has long been about restoring nature to a timeless, pristine state. But Darwin's most basic point, of course, was that nature is not static. It can't be held constant, it can't be rewound. He taught us that evolution, that life is always a process, and one that's always moving forward and never backward. So what then does it mean exactly to conserve evolution? And why has such an un-Darwinian goal so captivated these conservationists who really idolize Darwin? My book is asking then why conservationists have sought to preserve the islands as a living museum to Darwin, and what's happened as they've tried to return to a past state of evolution. I can give you a bit of a spoiler. Although Galapagos is considered one of the best preserved archipelagos in the world and estimated to retain 95% of its endemic biodiversity, even this remote archipelago isn't immune from environmental crisis. When I started working there in 2007, UNESCO had just put the islands on its list of World Heritage Sites in danger because of booms in tourism, migration, and introduced species. The islands have since been taken off that list, but a sense of crisis remains. And given this, I ask how we might begin to think about conserving evolution differently. Is it possible to conserve the process of evolution in the so-called Anthropocene age, where isolation is a thing of the past and no nature is untouched? And how then might we begin to think about conserving the future of evolution instead of trying to return to its prehistoric past? Those are the big questions that I am going to be working on while I'm here for the next 6 months. And the book examines these questions on the backs of the tortoises, hence the title. Now, these giant tortoises are the island's most iconic species. They're quite remarkable. They can grow to be more than 1 meter long and weigh 400 kilograms, up to 900 pounds. They live 150 to 200 years, maybe even more. And with their wrinkly skin and worn carapaces, they seem like they could be even older, prehistoric even. As charismatic conservation icons, they quite well embody the idea of pristine nature that's been at the center of Galapagos conservation. But despite their appearances, the tortoises' stories challenge the idea that they're hangovers from a prehistoric world. Indeed, I think that they show us how wrapped up human and natural histories are. In the book, I tell a series of tortoise stories to make the central point that far from being the pristine creation of nature alone, the Galapagos are a microcosm of evolution shaped by human action. Well, evolution isn't only about deep histories of biological adaptation, but it's a way of understanding the world and engaging with life that's history is much more recent and ongoing. I argue that we can't separate the biological history from the social history, as conservationists have tried to do. Now, when I first went to Galapagos as a new grad student, almost 10 years ago, I didn't have any of these questions or ideas in mind, and I wasn't even particularly interested in these tortoises. And I know there are a lot of grad students here, so if you want to ask me about research process, I'm more than happy to talk about that in Q&A or later at some point. But as I started working in Galapagos, I quickly found that these tortoises were a central part of the island's history. Even the core consistent thread that could take me from deep evolutionary history all the way up to the present. Galapagos giant tortoises have been capturing people's imaginations since 16th century Spanish sailors named the archipelago for them. There we go. Galápago is actually an old Spanish word for tortoise. Now, for centuries, buccaneers and whalers stopped in the islands to hunt turpin, as they called them, which are a slow-moving, portable, and by all accounts delicious source of meat for long oceanic voyages. Even Darwin ate the tortoises when he visited Galapagos. But his observations about them and other species made during just 5 weeks that he spent in the archipelago would forever change the fate of the islands. Since Darwin rode in the backs of tortoises, they've morphed from edible animals to endemic exemplars of evolution. By the turn of the 20th century, the tortoises were no longer understood as a God-given resource for human consumption, but as 15 different species that evolved on different islands and volcanoes around the archipelago. So you can see this here in this map, where all of the, I'll use my pointer so that I don't disappear from the video, all of the darkly shaded islands and each of these 5 triangles on this big seahorse-shaped island, these represent volcanoes, each one of these had its own species of giant tortoise. Now, over 4 centuries, the tortoises are thought to have been so delicious that sailors and buccaneers took more than 200,000 from the archipelago. So these lighter shaded islands here are islands where the native species has gone extinct. So today, 11 of these, what were once 15 species, still remain. To fight against extinction over the last century, biologists and national park guards have enclosed tortoises in nature reserves, gone to great lengths to breed them in captivity, and they've mounted endless campaigns to control introduced species, such as rats and goats that prey on tortoise eggs and also compete with juvenile tortoises for food. These projects have produced more than 4,000 baby tortoises. They've killed hundreds of thousands of rats and goats. And they've also inadvertently led to a plague of invasive fruit species that were once held in check by these goats. And this, I think, points to the uncontrollable nature of evolution. Conservation efforts have also turned the tortoises into globally recognizable charismatic species that are a favorite with the 200,000 tourists who now visit the islands every year. I've been collecting these kind of tortoise stories for about 10 years now. I spent a year in the archipelago doing ethnographic research off and on over the course of several years. For a month, I volunteered with the National Park's Giant Tortoise Breeding Program, and here I am on the bottom, scrubbing out one of these tortoise pools with some other volunteers. I also followed ecologists in the field, and up here I'm following someone who's working on a radiotelemetry project tracking tortoise migration. And I also did interviews with conservationists, visiting scientists, local government officials, and local residents, including fishers, farmers, and people who work in tourism. Most people don't know that about 30,000 people actually live in the Galapagos today. Most of them are Ecuadorians, so the islands are an Ecuadorian territory, but there's also a sizable population of European expats who have roots in the archipelago that date back to the 1930s. And there are also more North American and Europeans who've come more recently to work in conservation. I'll talk a little bit more about those population dynamics in a minute. The other major component of my project was archival research. I examined old travel narratives from 17th and 18th century sailors and worked in natural history museums in New York, Washington, San Francisco, San Diego, and London, all of which had collections of giant tortoises, like, whoops, I knew this was going to happen, like this guy at the bottom here, that had been made since Darwin. I also went to the government archives in Quito, Ecuador, and the UNESCO archives in Paris to research the political history of the founding of the Galapagos National Park and the Charles Darwin Research Station, both of which were founded in 1959. And as an aside, the Darwin Station is actually registered as a Belgian NGO, which is an interesting political structure. I can talk about the dates from the very early days of transnational environmental governance. Now that I'm making sense of all of this data I've collected, I think about my work as offering what I call a species history. The evidence I've collected crosses traditional distinctions between cultural histories of the animals and studies of their biology and their ecology. I'm trying to combine the cultural and the scientific to explain how these animals that were once prized as delicious meat and soup became understood as endangered species with long evolutionary histories. And I'm also examining how this evolutionary conception of species has shaped conservation strategies that aim to protect the islands as a natural laboratory. My basic argument here is that we can't think of species only as biological beings. Their histories are inseparable from global histories of human beings in the world. Now, to do this, I'm combining approaches from animal history, which I come to through environmental history, political ecology, and the history of science. The work in animal studies has positioned non-human actors as beings that not only have important stories to be told, but also whose stories cast new light on human entanglements with the natural world, highlighting that life is always a process of co-becoming or co-evolution. I find this work particularly helpful for examining material relationships between the giant tortoises and the thousands of sailors and local residents who they nourished over several centuries. I use political ecology approaches to animals and conservation to analyze how contemporary tourism economy rests on the backs of tortoises and other animals that visitors pay quite a bit of money to come and see in the wild. This work is particularly helpful for understanding why not everyone in the Galapagos understands the tortoises in the way that tourists do. In fact, few of the 30,000 human residents of the Galapagos even see these tortoises on a regular basis. And that's because they live in just 3% of the islands that are not protected as national parks, these urban centers. They're called Galapagos, the human residents of Galapagos. And among them, opinions of the tortoises are very divided. So some residents told me they saw them as oro or as gold, like the golden eggs of the tourism industry. But others, primarily the fishers, have taken the tortoises hostage, even slaughtered them in protest of conservation policies that spend millions of dollars on the health of animals, but neglect people's health and livelihoods. As symbols, then, the giant tortoises represent not only the island's prehistoric past, but also contested visions about their future. And third, bringing in the history of biology, by calling my work a species history rather than just thinking about it as an animal history, I'm aiming to make an intervention in that literature. My work in animal studies often engages with scientific studies to understand the ecological and biological qualities of animals. This is a productive move and I think crucial. But too often scientific knowledge seems to appear as a kind of baseline, or it's taken as face value. And I think examining the history of a species needs to include how these histories of scientific conceptions of animals actually relate to cultural, political, and environmental histories more broadly. So animal studies scholars, and I would argue all environmental history scholars, should treat scientific sources in the same way that we treat any other source, reading them against the grain and situating them in historical and political context. For me, engaging with the history of biology has been fascinating for understanding how much scientific ideas about the tortoises and what to do with them have changed over the past 100 years. Today, conservationists look to Darwin to explain why they protect the islands as a natural laboratory and where each species evolved in its particular habitat. But Darwin certainly wasn't thinking of the islands as a laboratory in the middle of the 19th century. That idea emerged in the early 20th century with the rise of field biology and ecology. So we can't assume any straightforward relationship between an evolutionary understanding of nature, in particular conservation policies. As I mentioned before, even Darwin ate tortoise soup when he visited Galapagos. He wasn't a conservationist as we might like to imagine him today. Actually, when Darwin visited Galapagos, naturalists thought that the giant tortoises were the same as the species of giant tortoises you can now find in the Indian Ocean. They were all called Testudo indica. The idea that there are actually 15 species that emerged that were just from endemic to Galapagos emerged in the decades after Darwin. The book chapter that I'm working on now traces the history of some of the binomial names of these species who were named for Darwin, but also others, including Albert Günther, who was a German herpetologist working at the British Museum, Rollo Beck, who was a natural historian collector, you can see up on the top, preparing a taxidermied tortoise, and another herpetologist, John Vandenberg, who worked at the California Academy of Sciences. So I won't go too much into the social history of these characters today, but I will tell you just enough to explain this, one of the great pictures. Oh, shoot. Pictures here. This is Walter Rothschild of the banking family, who was an amateur natural historian. We would probably say is on the autism spectrum today, had some developmental disabilities, but he was obsessed with natural history and quite a gifted naturalist. And he used his family's fortune to establish his own private natural history museum at Tring, outside of London. It's an amazing place. You can go and see it today exactly as it was 100 years ago. But he became really obsessed with giant tortoises as one of other species as well. His mentor was Albert Günther at the British Museum, taught him a lot about tortoises. And Rothschild in 1897 decided to mount an expedition to Galapagos where he paid for Rollo Beck and other naturalists to go to the Galapagos with the mandate of bringing back all of the tortoises that he could find, whether they were alive or dead, so that Rothschild could save them for science. And so Beck ends up going to Galapagos 3 times. The next 2 trips, another one for Rothschild, and then another later one in 1905, 1906 for the California Academy of Sciences. He brought back 264 tortoises that were eventually studied by John Vandenberg, who wrote the monograph that is the most significant monograph on tortoises and established them as individual species. So in talking about these social histories, I want to show that they're integral to what we understand the species to be. And by engaging with this early history of island biogeography, the chapter also shows how understandings of endemism and endangerment that are the basis of conservation today actually emerged together at the early 20th century. Well, the book also traces how naturalists' ideas about how best to deal with extinction changed over the 20th century, from Rothschild's model of taxidermying them in museums to save them. And I usually talk about this, let's see if I can get this right this time, by telling the story of one individual tortoise. This is Diego, and he is pictured here in his corral at the breeding center in the Galapagos. Diego was lucky enough to have evaded being eaten by sailors or collected by natural historians. But in 1928, he was taken to live at the San Diego Zoo as part of an experiment that was led by this man, who's Charles Townsend. He was the director of the New York Aquarium in the 1920s. He's here in Galapagos trying out some tortoise food. And he wanted to save the tortoises by setting up a series of breeding colonies in zoos across the southern United States and in the Caribbean. Those were areas that were thought to be climatically appropriate for the species. The zoo colonies never bred very well, but the tortoises were a hit in the children's zoos. This is not actually Diego. I don't have a picture of him from this point. And so Diego lived at the San Diego Zoo for about 40 years until 1972, when he was shipped back to the Galapagos to participate in a new in situ breeding program at this new Darwin station that had been opened in 1964. In the 40 years that Diego has been back in the Galapagos, he has become what the tour guides like to call a super macho, meaning he has sired almost half of the 4,000 baby tortoises that have been repatriated. So he has become a central actor then in this project of conserving evolution by helping to ensure the survival of his species. He has also caused some problems with genetic diversity in the species population. But he's also become quite popular with tourists. They're here looking over into his corral with a guide and one of the keepers. And these tourists are an important part of the story of conserving evolution because they help to pay for it. So when European and American scientists pushed the government of Ecuador to open the Galapagos National Park and let them establish this research station, they secured the government's agreement by promising that tourism would bring in revenue for the state. And I don't think that anyone at that point understood or could have imagined just how successful global tourism would become. In 1970, just 2,000 tourists visited the Galapagos, and as I mentioned before, last year the number was more than 215,000. Galapagos tourism has become an incredibly big business for the Ecuadorian economy. After oil, it's its leading source of foreign revenue. And this booming economy not only finances conservation efforts, it also funds local government. The tourists, when you go to Galapagos, pay right now a $100 entrance fee, most of which goes to the national park, but also local government institutions. And that helps fund conservation, but it also drives development in the islands as more hotels and restaurants are built to meet this growing demand. Conserving evolution then depends on selling evolution to tourists. Through tourism, attempts to conserve evolution have brought the challenges of modern development to the islands: population growth, wealth inequalities, extractive resource use, pollution, and foreign species introductions. And this is the crux of the crisis that I mentioned at the beginning. The very success of the Galapagos conservation and tourism undermines the ecological health of the islands. Now, most analyses of these current problems in the Galapagos frame this as a problem of globalization, this kind of boogeyman encroaching on a space of pristine, isolated nature that conservationists are valiantly trying to defend. But I think that examining the tortoises' histories shows that these problems aren't an external challenge to conservation, but they actually come from within. They're produced by the very approach that strives to isolate prized species from the world while turning a blind eye to the broader social and economic relationships that sustain conservation. This approach leaves conservationists unprepared to address the challenges of modern development, as well as broader troubles like the impacts of global climate change that kind of hang over the future of evolution around the world. I'll conclude today by returning to the question that I started with: how might it be possible to think about conserving evolution differently? And I will say that this is where my thoughts are provisional still, and what I'm trying to think about is less a set of prescriptions and more a set of questions and kind of guidelines for moving forward. And I think that to rethink conservation for the Anthropocene, the islands need to be reimagined as a laboratory of coevolution, where species with evolutionary lineages that stretch back millions of years intersect with human and economic flows that bring the world to these remote islands. The challenge for conserving the future of evolution is how best to manage the intersections of these trajectories. The Galapagos economy, and thus both conservation and the well-being of local residents, depends on nature tourism and the charisma of the archipelago's species. But conservation can't only protect iconic species in the service of a global public. The health of the islands and their species depends on addressing local issues of social and environmental justice. This opens complicated questions about what kinds of life and whose life are worth conserving and who gets to decide. But rather than trying to isolate tortoises as symbols of the past, learning from their histories will help us hold the paradoxes of conserving evolution in tension in order to protect a more sustainable future. So thank you very much.